Club. All right. Okay. So the question is, you're using Zula by Toni Morrison as your novel for the final paper. And the question is, how do I even get started? So because the framework that we've been using in class is the power of the gaze, you already know that there has to be a level of application, or at least some acknowledgement, right? That the analysis or the theme that you select to look closely at, because 6 to 8 pages is actually, double spaced, MLA format, all that stuff is actually not that long. So you can't cover every element about the gaze, right? There's just no way. It's too short of a paper. And what you really want to focus on is really like a very well thought out argument. And even if it's you're just picking one or two things about the power of the gaze and the novel, or the relationship between the power of the gaze and the novel, you don't have to go too broad, right? You could pick one element. So from the writing part, let's say that you're still formulating your questions, right? You're like, okay, I like, the friendship. So maybe I can think of, maybe I want to write about the friendship, right? Between Zula and Ned. What I want you to do is, if that's what you're curious about, or that's what you want to explore, I want you to start by giving me a very brief summary of what the novel is about, and specifically, what about the friendship looks interesting to you? So let me repeat myself. If you're looking at the screen and you're like, I know this is the book that I want to write, and it actually applies to both Zula and Dreaming in Cuban. I want you, if you were to tell someone that you're reading this book for class, right? And then they asked you, what is it about? What would be like the first things that would come to mind? Like it's a question. Do you have an idea of like what would pop up for you?
It's about like because there's a bunch of different perspectives in this book, and you get to read about the different parts of people's lives, and it like goes from different years throughout it, and it's about family, it's about struggle, it's about um just a family that like starts out where really big and like kind of shrinks as it goes on.
Yeah, and a lot of it having to do with, the intersectional oppressions of what it means to live at the bottom, right? And that being wordplay as well, right? Um, so I like that because you pointed out a couple of things, a couple of focal points, right? So you pointed out multi-generations, multiple perspectives, right? And like kind of like what comes up from that, right? Like it started off as a larger family, then it became small, right? We get to see, Zula and Ned as children, and then we get to actually see them as adults. Like, wow, right? We got to see them from their childhood, from the initiation of their friendship all the way to the end of the book, right? And what happens to their friendship at the end. So this type of multi-generational, multiple perspective offers what? What does it offer you?
Different like gazes.
Yeah. So a way to begin would be, right? Begin by talking about how you see the theme or the concept of the gaze in the novel you've selected. So, you can begin with a very brief summary of the novel, maybe a few things that actually stood out to you. Remember, you don't have to elaborate too much. You just want to kind of set the stage or set the context, outline the key players like the author and the title, and what some of the general things that the story is about. And then you begin to zone in, right? Then you begin to kind of like you start building in. So at that point, you could talk about that the novel lends to the use of the gaze by how the author uses multi-generational perspectives from young people, older people, people that are friends, people that are, not enemies, but in opposition to each other. And then at the end, you could say, and then you can answer the question. And so what does that do? Right. So I would rather everyone start this assignment, and whether I'm teaching an advanced course like a 102, or if I'm teaching an intro to college course like a 101, either way, I always tell students to start the same way. If they're looking at a Word doc on their computer and you're like, I don't even know where to start from the beginning. What is the book about? You have to be able to put that into words, right? In order to lay out the stage of who are the key players. What are some of the basic things we need to know about the book? Once you highlight that, or once you summarize that, I would say, I mean, if you're like a numbers person, I would say that your summary will most likely take up your whole first page and maybe even some of your second page. Make sure that that introduction is providing the stage, because it's the stage, it's the map, it's the blueprint for your whole paper. So that context area where you're summarizing the book and you're selecting your focal points, right? So an example I gave you was that I am so fascinated by the Zula and Ned's relationship and what that relationship represents, right? To even bigger ideas of what it means to be loyal, right? The topic of sisterhood, Jude being, for me, being an example of how the patriarchy comes between women's solidarity, but that's something that I observed, right, through my gaze. So I would start with a general summary of the book, and then I could say one of the things that stood out to me the most was the relationship between Ned and Zula. I would probably talk a little bit about Ned. I would talk a little bit about Zula. And then I would say something like, in my paper, I'm going to explore the themes of sisterhood, the power of the narrator, and something else. So I'm sure you're like, in your brain, you can kind of see that introduction growing and growing and growing and growing, right? Because that laying out of the stage is going to be so important. So how do you even begin to incorporate this concept of the gaze? Well, if you see yourself as someone that is not only imposing the gaze in your interpretation of the novel, right? But also, if you, depending on like your relationship as a reader, sometimes I feel like, characters or books talk to you, right? And you normally see there's a sense almost like that they're looking back. And let me tell you how I figured out with specifically with Zula, the scenes that made me uncomfortable, right? Or the scenes that kind of gave me pause, like, damn, that's messed up, right? It almost felt like, because there were moments, there's a lot of moments where you're just like, that is so messed up. Why did that happen, right? I feel like that's kind of like the power of the gaze from the author's perspective, or sometimes from the narrator's perspective. There's almost like like the character is looking back at you because you're having a reaction to something they did or said, right? So that's another way to look at it, right? Like power of the gaze and your reaction to characters, right? Certain characters kind of like give you a little bit of pause, right? Zula gave me pause. When I first read the book, I was like, no, she didn't, no, she didn't do that, but I had to kind of like process, like, why am I having this reaction, so it's kind of like the characters are gazing back, they're looking at you and they're making you kind of uncomfortable. So those are just a few ideas that I can give you, especially if you're so let's say you wanted to, okay, now you have a rough draft of your introduction, your thesis statement, you're on page 2, you're ready to hit the ground running on body paragraph number 1. What's going to be important is going to be that you follow the order of your introduction. So let me know if I'm talking too fast too, because I know I can, so that you follow the order of your introduction. If we've already established that the introduction is the blueprint of your whole paper, and we talked about how important that context is, right? Like how you understand the novel, what are some of the ideas that stood out to you, right? Then your first body paragraph would be about the first idea that you presented in your introduction.
Mhm.
You have to follow the order of how you laid out the order of ideas in your intro. That's the order of the body paragraphs. So if the first idea, right, that you introduce, after you give your summary of the book, you give us the key players, the author, the title, what the book is about, some of the main ideas or concepts that stood out to you. If the first concept you talked about is the gaze and Zula, then the first body paragraph has to be about the gaze and Zula. If the second concept you talk about is the role of multi-generational narrators, the next couple of paragraphs are going to be about the role of multi-generational narrators. You don't have to cover all of them, right? Just the ones that stood out to you. Might be one, might be two. It's up to you.
Okay.
And then finally, if you want to talk about, because race, gender, I would even say sexual orientation, right? Disability, like there's so many intersectional issues that come, or topics, not issues, but topics and issues that come up in Zula and in Dreaming in Cuban. This is applicable to both. That in a closing paragraph, right, as you're preparing to wrap this up, you can probably talk a little bit about that too. Like, why do you think the author would use these tools, these literary tools, right? And like, what is the message, right? Why would she do that? And Toni Morrison, luckily, we have a lot of interviews with her talking about Zula. Like, if you go on to, I'm sure you can find it, but if you go onto like YouTube and type in Toni Morrison Zula, there's so many interviews where she talks about Zula, so you can get a kind of like a glimpse of what her thought process behind that was. And I know that one of the interviews that I saw was just how important it was for her to write about just the what true intimacy between women platonic friendships, like what that true trust and intimacy look like, including the betrayal, including all of those things as well, because that's also part of the intimacy, right, of affection.
Mhm.
So I hope everything I just said was helpful. Was it helpful?
Yes.
You sure?
Yes.
You don't want me to say it in a different way?
No, I understand.
Okay, cool. All right, because I know I felt like at some point I was rambling. So, but I was like kind of like on a roll. So I was like, let me just keep going. Let's see. So, one of the other requirements after you do your introduction and you get the ball going, is that you have to have sources, right?
Mhm.
So they have to be academic sources. So for example, if you find an interview where Toni Morrison or Cristina Garcia are talking about their novel, like that can be an academic source. And I think that would fit really, really nicely. I would even say maybe in your conclusion, right? Because it would kind of like, you would kind of close the paper with how your ideas, right? Like the why she did what she did, and then your response to what she did. That would be like a lovely, just based on what you were telling me, like the multi-generational, that might be like a nice way to like seal your argument, right? Like it's kind of like where the reader meets the writer
Mhm.
type of conclusion. And because there's this paper short, 6 to 8 pages, that conclusion, it can't be an extra paragraph. You know how sometimes, I know that when I write papers and I have to write a conclusion, that like the conclusions are my like least favorite part of the writing process. But for a paper that's only 6 to 8 pages, the conclusion can't be a throwaway paragraph. Like you have to capitalize on that paragraph. So think about that again. Like, what is the final, maybe you can think about what the final value of the book is. Maybe you could think about something that the book inspired you to think about, anything that would offer an additional insight rather than you just using the conclusion to summarize. Not that you would do that, but you know what I'm saying? Sometimes when you've developed an argument for so long, you get to the conclusion and you're like, what else do I have to say? I already told you everything, right? So think about how you could use that conclusion strategically to seal your analysis, to close out your analysis, and not waste away like a really good opportunity to um to go from a B to an A, right? Because a paper with a solid conclusion, chef's kiss. But before, we'll get there eventually. First, we got to get you started. So did I answer your questions? Are the themes that you came up still themes that you think you'd want to continue exploring, or did you change your mind, or do you have other ideas?
I think I'm gonna work on the friendship, like you said, because I was thinking about it already.
Okay, so a nice paragraph that you could, or another academic source that you might want to look into is probably feminist theory,
Mm-hmm.
right? Any feminist theory that pops up that talks about like women's solidarity, the important, you know what I mean? I would also look at theories of intersectionality. So intersectionality basically being a tool of based on your identity and your positionality in society and your multiple identities, that is how you experience oppression, right? So if you're a woman in a country, a woman, a person of color, what I mean, like all those different someone that has with a disability, right, that's Buddhist, right, in a country that's Western, Christian, um you know uh uh completely discriminates or ignores people with disabilities, right, then the types of oppressions that you experience or how you experience the world is going to be very unique to you. So maybe you want to look into the theory of intersectionality and how like race and gender,
Mm-hmm.
right, kind of come together. What's another good theory? Oh, and I think bell hooks is the oppositional gaze. I gave you guys that essay on looking back. That might be another good academic source.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. I'm gonna stop recording. All right. Did that sound like a lecture?